Okay. It's been a while since I've done this. I'll have to hit the hand face. Okay. I had my whole shtick down several years ago. Look, it's an object. All right. Looks like we've got a quorum. So welcome to this week's APS Colloquium. Today we are fortunate to have Professor David Malaspina giving us the colloquium about his research. David is a lifer at CU. He came here to get his PhD in the physics department, graduated in 2010, and then stayed on at LASP in a variety of research scientist roles before joining the APS faculty in 2020. So David's an expert on understanding how the sun interacts with planets in our solar system. He's also an expert at building hardware to detect waves and electric fields on various space missions. To do this, including Van Allen probes, MMS, now the Parker Solar Probe, which I think you're going to talk about today, and then exciting missions of the future. So thank you very much, David. And
great.
I'm
Thanks.
going to hit the smiley face.
All right. All right, how's that? Everybody hear me all right? Awesome. Okay, yeah, so thank you, Kevin, for the introduction. So I'm David Malaspina, and I'm going to talk about Solar Probe. What's interesting about Solar Probe and worth talking about at this point is that we're halfway through the mission. So Solar Probe has been orbiting the sun since 2018, and it will continue to do so until at least 2025 if it isn't destroyed in the intervening time. But along the way, we've been learning a lot about how the sun works, about the physics and basic physics of our nearest star, and things that we can, of course, extrapolate to other stellar systems. And that's just a really cool graphic of Solar Probe, imaginary what it might look like when it gets close to the sun. If you could see the sun in UV, and Solar Probe got that close, which it won't. Okay, but I am going to start with this, and I know you can all read, but I'm going to read this to you because I think it's really interesting and really powerful. And whenever we talk about stellar winds, this is kind of a visceral way to think about it, and it has a connection back here to Colorado. So on the night of September 1st, we're high up in the Rocky Mountains sleeping in the open air, and a little after midnight, we're awakened by the auroral light, so bright that one could easily read common print. Some of the party insisted it was daylight and began the preparation of breakfast. That's incredible, right? So in 1859, in Colorado, the sky lit up with so much aurora, and so much of an intense aurora that people thought it was daytime. That's wild. So this is from the first edition of the Rocky Mountain News, and for those of you who've lived in Colorado a while, that used to be a paper up until about 10 years ago or so when it shut down. But what they were observing was the interaction of a stellar wind with a planetary magnetosphere. Right? That's what ends up generating the aurora. Now, there are many, many historical records of sort of extremely strong aurora from all different cultures. And sort of an in-depth study of this suggests that every 60 years or so, for the last 500 years, you get one of these enormous events. This particular event, and this is still going on today. All right, so we can still observe aurora. This is from September 3rd, recorded at Badlands National Park by Sydney, who's an APS undergrad. And so she managed to capture the aurora on her phone, not so far from here. So what was happening in 1859, what was observed here in particular was astronomer Richard Carrington observes a white light flare, or what we now call a white light flare. But what he saw was a group of sunspots that suddenly got very bright in the visible part of the spectrum. And this is his sketch of the cluster of sunspots. Let's see if I can. His sketch of that cluster of sunspots that eventually got really bright. And what he noticed is after that brightening 3 days later, Earth's magnetic field started to respond. They could measure perturbations to the Earth's magnetic field using magnetic field stations that were set up around the globe by the British Empire at that point. But what the curious thing was that it took 3 days for that response. And even in 1859, of course, and well before that, they knew that the speed of light was much faster than that. So there must be something else transmitting energy from the sun to the Earth, and it must be pretty darn slow compared to the speed of light. So what could that be? The thought was that maybe there's a wind coming off the sun. Maybe there are particles moving from the sun to the Earth. And over the next 100 years or so, evidence continues to mount that the star is in fact emitting particles, and those particles are in fact traveling through the space between the star and the planet and carrying energy along with them. And this culminates in about 1966 with the Mariner 2 mission, where Martian Neugebauer publishes the first direct observations of solar wind particles. So that's when we actually managed to capture these by a spacecraft and determine, their velocity, their density, their temperature, the properties of the particles coming off the star. And since, now that we know, of course, that the sun has a solar wind, we can extrapolate that to other stars and say many other stars have stellar winds. And those stellar winds can drive evolution in those other stellar systems. In particular, they can drive angular momentum loss because you can get magnetic coupling much further than out to the plasma that's being carried away from the stellar surface. So you can get those kind of disk-like structures of the wind coming off and the magnetic connection to them to slow down stellar rotation. Stellar winds can also modulate stellar mass loss, and they can carve out interstellar bubbles and produce really wonderful pictures. And also, of course, impact the interstellar space nearby. So the trouble with stellar winds is this, right? We have one star we can visit, and that's the sun. So we can go to that star, and we can explore the environment around that star. We can try to understand the physics of stellar winds from the sample of one that we have. And then, of course, extrapolate that to everywhere else we can. And in particular, even though we've been measuring the solar wind for many years now, you saw that first measurement was in 1966, so we've been measuring it for decades. In fact, we've measured it at all radial distances from about 0.3 AU all the way out to beyond 150 AU with Voyager. So we've been measuring the stellar wind for a long time over a lot of space. Why don't we understand how the stellar wind works yet? The key is sort of here in this kind of cartoon where well, it's not exactly a cartoon, but it's an illustrative figure. A candle generates a bunch of smoke. We've essentially been measuring the solar wind out here, where it's very heavily evolved, and trying to infer what's happening back here at the source. And so to measure a lot of the key solar wind properties that tell us or allow us to answer key questions about how the solar wind is generated, we really have to get closer to the source. And in particular, there are several fundamental questions that remain unanswered about the solar wind in particular and stellar winds in general. What processes are heating and accelerating the solar wind? What solar structures or structures on the surface of the star are really driving the source of the wind? Does it come from everywhere? Does it come from particular regions? How does a star process its dust cloud? This is also related to the solar wind, as I'll explain in a bit. And how are solar energetic particles accelerated? That last question I actually won't touch in this talk, but it is one of the major goals of the Solar Probe mission. So in an effort to get closer to the star and measure what's happening to the stellar wind as close to the source as we can, this mission was conceived. This mission has been renamed as Parker Solar Probe. The missions before it, or mission concepts before it, were called Solar Probe. Some sort of solar probe mission concept has existed since the 1960s and has been continuously tried to get through NASA. It finally succeeded in about 2009. That was the one that worked. And so construction and instrument selection started in about 2010. And eventually, this thing launched. And it launched in August of 2018. The orbital trajectory of the spacecraft is shown here. So from launch at Earth at 1 AU, it makes this big spiral in, and then they adjust the orbit to phase between Venus and the sun. So they're using Venus to shed angular momentum and step ever closer inward to the sun. This has the added benefit of stretching out the main part of the mission for a long time, so it takes a while to get close. And it kind of makes the most exciting scientific results at the end of a mission, which is a little bit different than many NASA missions. So the launch was in 2018, launched from Earth. I've got everything here in AU and in solar radii. We tend to talk in solar radii because it's just a more convenient unit for where we're going, but I have the conversion up here for you. And so we've been progressing closer and closer to the sun. Perihelion 13 happened about a week ago, or maybe a week and a half ago. And perihelion 13 is at this same radial distance. We're getting to 13 solar radii. And those distances are from the center of the sun, not from the surface. So we're actually a little bit closer to the surface structures. And eventually, in 2024, we will get 9.8 solar radii from the center of the sun. And then the prime mission is slated to end in 2025, of course, assuming the spacecraft survives. But so far, so good. We made it to 13. We're halfway through. Solar probe looks like this. I've labeled most of the important bits. The most important bit, of course, is this heat shield. There's this large structure here that keeps the solar radiation from heating up the main body of the spacecraft too much, kind of by keeping it in the shade. There's also heat exchanger. There's a fluid heat exchanger tubes that run on the back of the heat shield and run up to these radiators to allow it to shed heat. Upon closest approach, the spacecraft hits, or the front of the heat shield will hit something like 2,000 degrees C. So this thing has to survive a pretty extreme environment. And then when it gets out by Venus, everything, of course, gets very cold, relatively speaking. So there's extreme thermal gradients through the orbit. A few things, and then there's these solar panels that feather back and forth. So when the spacecraft is far from the sun, they are out to gather the most light possible. And when it gets close to the sun, they peel back because they can't take the heat. A few of the sensors have to stick out into the sunlight to function. One of them is the Fields antennas. So these 4 antennas, there's a 4th one down here, that are in the plane of the heat shield, and then the Faraday cup that sticks out that way. So we're measuring electric and magnetic fields using the magnetometers here, magnetometer here. Those all measure the magnetic fields. This measures electric fields as well as the 4 antennas there. The Faraday cup measures ions, so stares kind of directly at the sun, thermal ions. We also get thermal ions from the sweep sensors. The ESIS instrument measures high energy particles, and then WSPR measures photons, but it can only sort of measure, it doesn't look at the sun, it actually looks off to the side and looks for light scattered off of electron density fluctuations in the wind. And this, of course, is how we talk back to Earth. The one interesting thing about Solar Probe is that it can either operate the high gain antenna and talk to Earth, or it can operate the instruments, but it can't do both, not at the same time. And so what happens each orbit is we stop talking to it, they turn on the instruments, and we hope it comes out on the other side. So every orbit, we wait for a beacon tone that says, I'm alive, I survived this encounter. And so we just got that about a week ago from Encounter 13, which was exciting. An important piece of Solar Probe, and in particular of the Fields instrument, which measures electric and magnetic fields, is this thing. This is the digital fields board, and this we built here at CU. So this is a signal processor, in particular for frequencies from DC to about 75 kilohertz. This thing is it's about that big, roughly. And on that board, we have 2,200 components, which is a pretty darn dense board. The whole thing takes 2 watts, and it weighs, half a kilogram. It can survive extreme radiation environments, extreme temperature environments, and of course designed to last the time of the mission. And of course, many, many people worked on this, in particular Bob Ergen, myself, Mary Bolton, Mark Keene, David Summers, Magnus Carlson, many other engineers over at LASP. So what do we have? We have a whole bunch of stellar mysteries. We have Parker Solar Probe, and we finally had some time, not only to gather the data, but to do some data analysis. And all this leads to some new progress understanding stellar physics. So there's been a huge amount of novel research out of Solar Probe. In particular, there's the Space Sciences Review paper, which tries to collect a lot of the first results from the first 3 years. It's in review now, but it will be out relatively soon. And what I'm going to focus on today is some of the key advances, but I'm going to focus on ones where CU students played a major role. except for this first one. This one was not so much done by CU students, but it is very cool, and so I do want to point it out. OK, so this first question, right, we're trying to understand how the solar wind is heated and how the solar wind is accelerated. In particular, focusing on acceleration, one of the major theories for solar wind acceleration is this idea of an ambipolar electric field. I'll walk you through the cartoon version. Basically, in the corona, if you have a plasma that has ions and electrons at an equal temperature, the electrons are much less massive, and therefore they're going to be moving faster. The high energy tail of that electron distribution is basically the particles that are moving the fastest, and they can escape solar gravity. They can make it out of the corona. As they make it out of the corona, they form a beam of particles, or eventually they narrow into a beam of particles through adiabatic focusing. That's what's typically called the strahl. So you have electrons escaping, but ions not escaping. When that happens, you build up an electric field. And that electric field then sets up such that you're pulling ions out away from the corona. So this is thought to be one possible way that a solar wind can be accelerated. Now, there's a prediction associated with this, and that's some of the electrons are going to be ballistic. That means they're going to start to escape the corona, but at some point, the combination of that electric field and solar gravity are going to cause them to fall back. So they're not going to make it all the way out. So some fraction of the electrons are thought to, this is a natural consequence of this sort of ambipolar theory. And what this should do is it should produce a strict energy cutoff in the sunward direction. There should be some particles that escape completely, some that don't quite escape and then come back. And when they get near the sun, they'll show this kind of cutoff energy. This is referred to as a sunward deficit. Basically, there should be missing electrons at certain energies in the sunward direction. And lo and behold, Solar Probe observes this. In particular, they can measure the sunward deficit directly by measuring the electron distribution functions. And the estimates that have been done so far is that this can account for 100% of the slow wind terminal velocity. The slow solar wind being up to about 300 kilometers per second. But this is not the full picture, because the sun also emits, of course, a lot of fast wind that can move from 500 to even 1,000 or faster kilometers per second. And the ambipolar electric fields that have been measured can't account for that. So we've got part of the picture now, but not the whole picture. OK, so now I'll get into more stuff that we've been working on here at CU. One of these is, of course, related to the heating of the solar wind. The solar wind is, well, it's a gas, right? It's a plasma that has a heat source at the sun, and then it expands outward. But it cools off as it expands, like any gas kind of would, but it cools off slower than an adiabatic theory would predict. So what we're looking at here is the proton temperature as a function of distance from the sun. This is from a spacecraft called Helios that went into about 0.3 AU and then measured out to about 1 AU. This is a prediction for an adiabatic gas, what that cooling would look like, and this is what the solar wind actually does. And so what we've been able to observe is that the solar wind is self-heating. There is some process by which the wind is converting something in the wind into thermal heat of the particles. And one of the leading theories is that we're looking at collisionless turbulent dissipation of Alfven waves. OK, that's a big term. What the heck does that mean? That means that somewhere on the solar surface, there are large-scale motions of plasma. There are magnetic fields that are rooted into that plasma in the solar surface. Those magnetic fields, that plasma, as it moves around on the solar surface, it causes these large-scale motions of magnetic field. Large-scale motions of magnetic field in a plasma can cascade down, basically exchange energy between large scales and small scales through what's known as a turbulent cascade. There are sort of three ranges that are typically considered in a turbulent cascade. There's this what's known as the injection range, or the scale at which you're adding energy to the system. There's an inertial range, a scale at which you're passing energy to smaller and smaller scales. And then there's what's known as a dissipation range, where you're taking that energy and then you're turning it into heat. You're removing it from the fluctuations. You can think of a waterfall as a good analogy for this. So the injection scale is sort of falling off the edge of the cliff. The inertial scale is all the little turbulent eddies at the bottom that pass energy down to smaller and smaller scales. And then dissipation is the friction of those particles rubbing against each other and heating the water at the bottom of the waterfall. So all that initial kinetic energy eventually ends up or potential energy from the height eventually ends up as heat. Solar wind is doing something similar, but with magnetic and velocity fluctuations. And so one thought is that this dissipation can account for the heating of the wind. At 1 AU, we've been measuring this for a very long time, and in particular, the smallest scale fluctuations, where the dissipation is thought to happen, are often interpreted as kinetic Alfvén waves. This is a type of Alfvén wave that when you get down to sub-proton gyroscales, can end up with strong parallel electric fields, parallel to the background magnetic field. Those fields can then land out damp and heat the plasma. And so this is something that's been observed at 1 AU for a long time and has even been observed directly by comparing fields measurements with particle distributions. What's different near the sun is that, well, okay, let me back up. At 1 AU, these kinetic Alfvén waves, anywhere you look in the solar wind, you find them. So the dissipation scale just is kinetic Alfvén waves. To quote a grad student of mine, Peter Tatum, it's kinetic Alfvén waves all the way down. Right? So that's what it looks like at 1 AU. When you get near the sun, what you find is that the kinetic Alfvén waves are actually sporadically distributed. They're completely non-uniform in space. And so this implies that whatever heating is associated with those kinetic Alfvén waves is also uneven in space, if that's a valid theory for heating the solar wind. So now we have this ability to test it because the solar wind becomes so patchy close to the sun. Right, and so this is some work that Peter has done or is working on recently. What he is doing is he's observing intense kinetic Alfvén waves near the sun. And this is really interesting because the amplitudes of all the Alfvén waves go up the closer you get to the source. And so with more intense kinetic Alfvén wave amplitudes, we can measure them with better signal to noise out to higher frequencies. And so we can test them against some of the theoretical predictions out to a much different regime than we can see at 1 AU. And so this is what Peter's been doing. And what he's been looking at, in particular, this is the electric to magnetic field ratio as a function of frequency observed kind of in the spacecraft frame and a little bit normalized. And you can kind of barely see it on here. There's a red line here, which is the sort of theoretical prediction for what that E/B ratio ought to do. And you can see there's actually a strong deviation from it at a particular point in the spectrum. At the same time, there's a deviation from the kinetic Alfvén wave theory. The electric and magnetic field fluctuations associated with those Alfvén waves become incoherent. E and B stop moving together. And so what Peter has noticed basically is that there are strong deviations from the kinetic Alfvén wave theory. And what he's trying to test is a couple of theories as to why that might be happening. One of these is this idea of what's known as a Helicity Barrier, basically that you get energy sort of piling up at a particular ion scale and converting more into ion cyclotron waves than it does into kinetic Alfvén waves. And so some of Peter's current research is trying to understand whether these deviations to the kinetic Alfvén wave theory are consistent with this Helicity Barrier theory or not. Another part of heating the solar wind, a second theory for what might be happening, is that we know in turbulent fluids and in turbulent fluids you kind of form boundary layers. In turbulent plasmas you form current sheets. So if you take a plasma and you stir it up in a turbulent way, it will become a kind of a mess. You can imagine sort of stirring oil into water, and you get these thin boundary layers. In a plasma, those are sharp magnetic field gradients. A sharp magnetic field gradient is a current. And so you form, or the two come together. So you get these sort of current sheet structures in the solar wind. And the closer we get to the sun, the more intense these current sheets are getting, the sharper the magnetic deflections are becoming. The other thing we're seeing is that they're non-uniformly distributed in space, just like the kinetic Alfvén waves. There are places where there are an awful lot of these current sheets and places where there are very few. And so if these currents driven by the current sheets are affecting solar wind heating, we now have a natural experiment where we can test a region where they exist and a region where they don't. And so this is some work that's being done by Sydney Furman, so CU APS undergrad. And what she's doing is looking at how current sheet properties and occurrence vary with solar wind magnetic structures. So depending on what structures are in the wind, are you seeing more or less current sheets? How are their properties changing, and how is that impacting the heating? Another major result from Solar Probe is that as we get very close to the sun, we find that the solar wind gets patchier and patchier. There are discrete regions of wind that have discrete properties. In particular, what we're starting to see is that some of these patches have distinct speeds. They have distinct radial magnetic field structures. There are these things that we've identified called switchbacks, where the magnetic field temporarily reverses back toward the sun and then shoots out back sort of away from the sun again, or with the other sense. But either way, the radial component is changing. These patches also show different helium abundance, implying that they're, or alpha abundance, implying that they're attached to different source regions on the solar surface, and they have different temperatures. This is a time series. This is looking at the radial component of the background magnetic field. The sort of typical behavior, if you follow the bottom edge of this curve, is shown on there. And then these jumps up are those switchback structures I was just talking about, temporary reversals in the radial component of the magnetic field. And what was published recently by Stuart Bale was that these switchback structures come in patches. So here's a patch, here's a patch, here's a patch. And each patch of those switchback structures correlates with an alpha abundance variability, with a speed variability, and with a temperature variability. And when you take the path of solar probe over the solar surface and you say, what are the solar structures that timing corresponds to, what he finds is that they map out to supergranular structures. So roughly the time cadence of these patches matches out to a spatial cadence related to sort of supergranule scale sizes on the solar surface. And the current theory is this idea that we're seeing these sort of expanding magnetic funnels that are coming out of structures spaced by about a supergranule, which is something like 30 megameters or so. Another important result, this is, at least I think it's important because I did it. No, I think it's actually important for the structure of the solar wind, is that when you look between those patches, you see something very different. So in those patches, you see a lot of variability. You see these magnetic field structures, these sudden reversals. But when you look between them, the solar wind does this. You're looking at the velocity, the density, and the temperature of the wind. And then this, and most importantly, is the magnetic field. And in these in-between regions, the solar wind is very, very calm. Most of the turbulence goes away. It drops by over 2 orders of magnitude. The magnetic field fluctuations, the density, the temperature, everything just kind of doesn't turn off, but it gets very quiet. Not only that, but the background magnetic field direction has a very, very strong preference to point in the theoretical Parker spiral direction. Parker spiral is a theoretical construct that just says if I release a parcel of plasma from the surface of the sun and let it propagate out radially, and then I take the rotation of the sun and say I must then therefore be magnetically connected, you get like a lawn sprinkler type effect. That's a purely theoretical concept. But here, this thing, in these regions of space, the magnetic field pegs to the Parker spiral direction to better than a degree. So there's something different about these patches. We've started to call them quiescent regions. And one thought is that they contain, for example, the pristine solar wind, or the least evolved solar wind from its coronal origin. It has the least bumps and wiggles on it, and it's probably just the solar wind directly moving away from the solar surface, being minimally perturbed by magnetic field fluctuations. And again, this is an important thing to discover because we can use this to test ideas of turbulent heating and acceleration. If we compare the temperature of the solar wind in a quiescent region or in a turbulent region, well, there's very little turbulence here. So now we can use that variable to determine what's going on.
So is it adiabatic on those spirals?
Haven't checked that yet, but that's a great question. So in particular, Ben Short, who's a CU physics grad student who's working on this, he's been digging into the quiescent regions. So what he's been doing is basically trying to understand their basic properties, to track their temperature, their velocity, their magnetic field behavior by doing these sort of superposed epoch studies where we identify a section of quiescent wind and kind of pile them all up on each other. And what you're looking at here, you're looking at sort of, this is deflection angle. These are the 3 components of the magnetic field. And this is sort of a normalized time interval. And he's just drawn these sort of start and stop things on here to show you where the quiescent regions begin and end, but you can see that the magnetic field is significantly different inside. And in particular, one of the things we see is that we see none, absolutely 0 of these switchback structures occur in the quiescent regions. And so if those switchback structures are related to these magnetic funnel structures on the surface, then How come we're not getting any of them at all in the quiescent regions? So this is something that Ben's been working on and trying to understand if the quiescent regions are really the fundamental unit, of the solar wind. The third big thing that we've been working on here at CU, and this is a little bit unique to CU because, of course, we have the dust physics folks over on Marine Street, so the Impact Center. We have kind of unique abilities to look into some of this and some really good expertise here on campus. But I'll explain in a minute how we connect to that. But this third question is, how does a star process its stellar dust cloud? And what can we learn about that from Parker's Solar Probe? From this picture, this is just a great artist's impression, I think, of what the sun's interplanetary dust cloud probably looks like. It's a bit of a cartoon at this point. But this is from a PhD thesis by Brian May. And if those of you who don't know Brian May, that is Brian May. He did his PhD thesis on interplanetary dust cloud and what it would look like. So how does a star process its interstellar dust cloud? What are all the pieces that go on here? First of all, there are inputs into the system. There are comets and asteroids and other objects. There's even interstellar dust flowing through the solar system. Those are all sort of inputs of material and mass. All that material eventually collides with itself or each other, and so you get what's known as collisional grinding. So larger material strikes each other, breaks up into smaller and smaller pieces, and you get sort of like a cascade, not like the turbulent cascade, but still a cascade to smaller particles. Those particles undergo sunward transport by the Poynting-Robertson effect. Poynting-Robertson effect is based on sort of a star's gravity and its luminosity and a little bit about the spectrum of light that it's emitting. And so that basically causes, it's a sort of relativistic effect that causes dust grains to slowly march in toward the star. When they get close enough, and here's where Solar Probe comes in, several interesting things start to happen. One is when you get close enough, you can actually get the radiation pressure from the star to overcome solar gravity for certain size dust grains. And what that means is that they get ejected from the system. So they're just kicked out on hyperbolic orbits entirely. The other thing that happens is you get conversion to plasma. So when these dust grains get ground down small enough through sputtering and sublimation type processes, they can actually be converted straight into plasma and then also blown out of the system. They're blown out of the system through electromagnetic interactions. They basically become very massive pickup ions, for those of you who do planetary stuff. So you put in particles at the largest scales, they get broken down to the smallest scales, and when they become at these smallest scales, they get ejected. And what we can explore with Solar Probe is what happens down here. Because now that we're close to the sun, we can measure points in the orbit where the radiation pressure becomes high, where these particles are just being born in terms of bursting and sublimation, and where the electromagnetic forces become quite strong because you're in the strong part of the magnetic field. So how do we even detect dust on Solar Probe? Solar Probe has no dust detector, but what it does have is electric field antennas. And electric field antennas are capable of detecting dust impacts through what's known as impact ionization. So when a particle hits at what's known as hypervelocity, basically more than 1 kilometer per second, it not only vaporizes, but it ionizes itself. And not only itself, but a piece of the spacecraft, which we'll get into in a bit too. But when that happens, so dust comes in, here's the cartoon, you get a rapidly expanding electron cloud, followed a little bit after by a rather pokey ion cloud, and the charge separation between those can help, or can be detected by an electric field antenna. There's also some of this impact charge because the spacecraft itself is charged. Any object in a plasma becomes charged to some degree. Some of these escaping particles don't actually escape. They end up recollected by spacecraft surfaces. That perturbs the electric field antennas as well. So the upside to this is that your entire spacecraft is your dust detector, kind of by accident. But it means you have an enormous collecting surface area compared to most of these things. Most dedicated dust detectors have a surface area about that big. We have the entire spacecraft, which is something like, it could fit maybe from that wall to that wall. So that's really nice. The downside is we really don't know what we're getting hit by. So we don't know how fast it was going, how massive it was, or what it was made of. All we know is we got hit. But we can do some great science with that anyway. In particular, one of the things that was determined early on in the solar probe mission is that we can determine where we got hit. So there's 4 antennas on solar probe that stick out in the plane of the heat shield like this. So this is looking from the back end of solar probe toward the sun. So imagine you're standing behind the spacecraft looking sunward. These antennas poke out like so. When a dust impact occurs in a particular location, it perturbs the antennas closest to it the most. And so we can figure out a directionality of each impact to plus or minus 90 degrees. But if we build up enough impacts, which we have great statistics because we have the whole spacecraft to do this with, we can figure out where the dust was coming from over the course of the orbit. So this is some few plots showing that. So this is the inbound part of the orbit. The sun is at the center. Solar probe is here. It's traveling through the orbit along that path. When we're far from the sun, we see this. This is basically, I've taken a histogram of all the dust impacts and I've wrapped it around in a polar sort of way so that it kind of mimics this. So what you're looking at is the number of dust impacts as a function of angle around, sort of azimuthal angle around the spacecraft. So when we're far from the sun here, you can see that we're getting roughly the same number of impacts from every direction. So we're seeing sort of an isotropic kind of dust population. When we get very close to the sun, the spacecraft is now moving faster than the local Keplerian velocity of the dust particles, so we're running into them instead of them running into us. And you can see that most of the dust particles then come from a particular direction. So we can see the directionality focus down. And then when we come back out, it kind of relaxes. The spacecraft actually stopped taking data on this orbit about here, but if you take it out further, it relaxes back out to isotropic. So using this, Anna was doing a bunch of research using this directionality data. And what she found was that on encounter 4, this did not happen on encounters 1, 2, or 3, but on the 4th encounter, she noticed this structure here. So on the outbound part of the orbit, suddenly there was dust coming from a direction where we hadn't seen it on the other 3 orbits. So there's some sort of anomalous dust population. That anomalous dust population in the directionality corresponded to this additional peak. You're looking at the impact rate of dust that we've measured as a function of time. Perihelion is here. And this is that second anomalous peak. These models, so we worked with some modelers at Princeton who were working on trying to understand the known populations of interplanetary dust and to see if solar probe's observations were consistent with them. When you combine sort of gravitationally bound grains, which is this the blue curve on here, and you combine that with the grains that are being ejected from the solar system, which are called beta meteoroids, they're shown here. Combined together, they get the purple curve. So the purple curve is what we predicted to see. And that matched actually pretty well what was happening on encounters 1 through 3. But on encounter 4, Anna discovered that the dust impact rate was completely different, and it was coming from a completely different direction than we expected it to. And so the thought here was that maybe she had discovered an entirely new population of interplanetary dust. That's what sort of needed to explain that. And in fact, this got a fair amount of press attention, and it got a hold of the NASA Goddard Visualization Studios got a hold of this and made a pretty slick graphic that kind of explains what's going on, or what we think is going on. This is our interpretation of the data. So what's being shown here are nominal beta meteoroids. These are collisions between particles close to the star, creating particles small enough that the stellar radiation pressure blows them out on these hyperbolic orbits. That's what we expected to see based on observations from 1AU. Okay, here we go. But if you introduce another object, in this case, the debris trail of the asteroid Phaeton, this is the one that leads to the Geminid meteor shower. If you introduce that object, suddenly you've increased the amount of particles that are participating in collisions, but only at a localized point in the orbit. And that creates what we're calling a beta spray, another interaction between the interplanetary dust cloud and those objects. And so they create these sort of an extra source of dust that comes out with a particular direction. Actually, it would spray out this way, which is exactly where we're seeing it. And it would create an additional amplitude bump. Basically, we'd see more counts per unit time, but only at a fixed part of the orbit. And so this is the interpretation we were going with. And in terms of stars processing their stellar dust cloud, what we determined was that this collisional grinding process can be accelerated by any objects that cross near the star. So the more objects, large objects you have that are crossing near the sort of interstellar system, the faster your collisional grinding is going to go. And the other thing we could do with the solar probe observations is actually estimate the zodiacal cloud or the interplanetary dust cloud erosion rate. So now we know how fast our star is ejecting that material. And it's about 100 kilograms per second, roughly. So we can do a lot of really neat dust science with solar probe, even though it wasn't designed as a dust detector. A few other things that we've been doing, so just highlighting some of their work by some CU undergrads. So Alex has been working on trying to understand the dust-free zone. So there's been this prediction for a very long time that if you get close enough to the sun, the intensity of the radiation ought to be enough to completely sublimate the dust. Just eliminate it entirely, right? You're turning it down to molecules that are in atoms that are then getting blown out with the solar wind. And this has been a prediction since about 1925 or so, but you can't observe it from Earth. But we can observe it on solar probe. In particular, the WSPR instrument, the camera here on the side, has been observing sort of scattered light from the F corona. And what they have seen is that the closer you get to the sun, they see that F corona brightness drop away within about 5 solar radii. So they believe they've detected that dust-free zone. In the lead up to the dust-free zone, there's sort of a plateau where the dust density stops increasing and flattens out. And so what Alex is doing is using the in-situ data from the electric field instruments to try to decide whether the in-situ data is detecting the same plateau in the dust flux that WSPR thinks it's seeing. So we're trying to verify the remote observation with an in-situ one. Another wild thing that's been happening is some of these particle impacts on solar probe have been so intense that they've been generating magnetic field impulses, which is really weird because everything we know about that plasma cloud that comes off from those impacts is all electrostatic. So if it's electrostatic, how in the world are we getting perturbations in the magnetic field data? This is something that Adele has been looking into, trying to understand if it's related to the impact location on the spacecraft or some different physics about the impact itself. And this is finally, this kind of graphic, again, came out of some press release associated with some of this stuff. We had a paper that we put together with the WSPR camera folks related to some of these impacts. So some of the really big impacts, we see a perturbation to the electric field, we see a perturbation to the magnetic field sensor, but at the same time, these are 3 successive images from this camera. This is before the impact. That's sort of what you expect to see, which is density fluctuations in the solar wind. This is during the impact, and this is after the impact. So what we believe we're seeing is that when some of these larger particles strike the spacecraft, they're actually creating very slow-moving debris clouds. We're shedding material off the spacecraft because the impact is so intense. We think it's paint chips or MLI, which is the insulation around the spacecraft, and it's creating these slowly expanding clouds. The other thing that happens is back here, Parker Solar Probe has these 2 star cameras that they use to orient the spacecraft, to figure out where they are. The star cameras are periodically getting blinded by the chaff, I guess, that's coming off from these impacts. And so we were contacted by the spacecraft team, and they said, hey, you guys are doing dust stuff. Have you noticed the dust impacts being particularly intense at these times when we keep losing orientation on the spacecraft? And it turns out they matched up 1-to-1. So we've determined that. The other interesting thing, these are other images of the dust debris moving, or the debris created by the impacts moving in front of the WSPR camera. And some of them actually show really curved trajectories. So we can see electrostatic interaction between the stuff that comes off the spacecraft and the spacecraft body itself. And this is really neat because this is related in physics-wise to the creation of pickup ions. So when we get things like comets and asteroids that grind each other into small pieces close to the sun and then get picked up and carried away by the solar wind, we now have a controlled experiment that does that. Not exactly controlled. We can't control when it happens, but we can control where it happens. And we know the solar wind speed relative to the spacecraft, roughly the mass of the particles that are coming off. And so we can do these sort of experiments to use this data as an experiment to understand the pickup of large ions or large dust particles close to the sun. Okay, so let's wrap this up. So we've been talking a bit about the heating and acceleration of the solar wind. What have we learned from halfway through the solar probe mission? we've learned that the ambipolar electric field is a significant solar wind accelerator. It can account for the slow solar wind, but it's not the full story. It can't explain the fast solar wind. We've been looking into heating via turbulent dissipation based on kinetic Alfven waves. What we've seen is that kinetic Alfven waves behave very differently near the sun than they do at 1 AU. In particular, they appear in little patches, which gives us an opportunity to investigate their role in heating. And of course, the role of current sheets, because they also show up very differently near the sun than they do at 1 AU, much less homogeneous. We're also trying to understand, of course, what are the solar structures that are at the source of the solar wind. We found that the solar wind is patchy. There are chunks of the solar wind that have certain properties and chunks that have other properties. And the supposition at this point is that these map back to different regions on the solar surface. We've also discovered these things we're calling quiescent regions that are places between the patches where turbulence kind of dies away. It follows the notional Parker spiral. Is this the least evolved solar wind? Are we seeing the fundamental base behavior of the wind? Possibly. We haven't figured that out quite yet. And toward this third question, how does a star process its dust cloud? We've been able to make these estimations of where the sublimation zone actually is, so where the dust is being destroyed by the star. And we've been able to observe that objects on near-sun orbits are increasing the collisional grinding rate. So the more large objects you have crossing that boundary, the faster your dust cloud is going to dissipate. And then finally, one very last thing I didn't talk about, but is kind of a cool thing in terms of the mission. At 1 AU, the solar wind is super Alfvenic. This means that the solar wind velocity, the velocity with which it's moving away from the sun, is faster than magnetic fluctuations in that medium. That means if you kick off a magnetic wave, it cannot make it back to the sun because it's being blown out faster than it can run sunward. You can think of this kind of like supersonic, but it's Alfvenic because it's the magnetic field fluctuations instead of a sound fluctuation. And so a lot of the theories for solar wind heating and acceleration are based on what happens inside what's known as the Alfvén surface, or the boundary at which the solar wind becomes super Alfvenic. And there were a huge number of predictions for where that Alfvén surface might occur, anywhere from 5 solar radii to 50 solar radii. It was a pretty big range coming into the mission. But Solar Probe actually crossed the Alfvén surface for the first time in April of 2021, and it crossed it at about 18. So the predictions were from 5 to 50. It was kind of in the middle. So, not too bad. And so there were a whole bunch of press releases that came out that said, okay, Solar Probe has now touched the sun, right? Because the tagline for the mission was this was a mission to touch the sun. But the idea is that we actually have crossed into the corona. We've crossed into a place where the magnetic field of the sun can directly communicate with the plasma of the solar wind. That's what happens below the Alfvén surface. That's why it's significant in terms of solar wind acceleration physics. So that did happen back in 2021, and it's happened several more times since. So on each one of these encounters, we're now getting longer and longer intervals where the probe is dipping below the Alfvén surface. This first interval was for like 20 minutes or something. Now we're dipping below for several hours at a time. But that Alfvén surface is generally much closer to the sun than most of the predictions had estimated. So finally, as we go forward, there's a lot of things going on with solar physics. I'm sure many of you here know. There's Solar Probe, of course, out there getting very close to the sun, taking in-situ data. There's Solar Orbiter, taking in-situ data and remote sensing data from about 0.3 AU. On a different orbit, but occasionally the orbits line up in just a way to do some great physics. And of course, there's DKIST, taking very high resolution temporal and spatial resolution images of the solar surface. And so all this is happening at the same time. And so we're in a great time when we can make enormous progress in understanding solar and stellar physics. The very last thing I want to point out is that this thing, our relatively humble Solar Probe digital fields board, which is just one piece of electronics, one little slice in that whole instrument on Solar Probe, has led to a whole bunch of other missions that are either about to launch or will be launched in the near future. In particular, there's the Canvas CubeSat, which will be measuring VLF waves triggered by lightning as they propagate out of the ionosphere and enter the magnetosphere. There's the Lucy lunar surface experiment, where we're going to be directly measuring the electric fields on the surface of the moon in particular trying to understand the interaction with the solar wind and the plasma sheath near the surface of the moon. This is actually flying a flight spare from Solar Probe, so we refurbished the flight spare hardware, and it's going to go out on that commercial lander. Bits of Solar Probe ended up in the Ether instrument, recently selected for the GDC mission. Bits of it, or evolutions of it, I guess, will fly on the Cousin sounding rocket out in 2025. And some of this dust detection stuff that we've determined with Solar Probe is now being used to design dust detectors, in this case for the International Space Station, but for other environments as well. And then, of course, there's these mission concepts off in the future, one related to radiotomographic measurements of the plasmasphere, and then, of course, way off an interstellar probe. These are concepts right now that could potentially incorporate instruments, that originated in that design. So that brings me kind of to the end of all this. I'll leave it up with the interesting stellar physics stuff, but thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Dave, for a fantastic talk. Kevin had to leave early. I'm going to let you take questions. This is being recorded, so I'll try and catch you with this microphone so that we can hear your thing. Please put your hand up. And the tradition is that the first questions go to the graduate students. So we're looking at you.
I just want to say first, great talk. So I have a question about the scale of the switchbacks.
Yeah.
You said that you see variations on kind of supergranular scales, which I guess in retrospect kind of makes sense. But I was wondering if there's been any attempts to try and look at where when those are occurring and comparing it to the WSPR data to see if there's any correspondence in solar wind structures that you're flying through. Can you see, variations in like this, the streamer density on those scales? Maybe not necessarily in the path of the spacecraft, but maybe in the perpendicular direction.
Right. So WSPR, really the only thing you're measuring in terms of plasma properties is density, right? That's pretty much what it can get. As far as I know, there have been initial efforts in that direction. I know there's a paper in preparation, but I don't know of any solid results that have come out of that study yet. But yeah, people are looking into that, trying to understand if there's sort of density patches that you see in WSPR, because WSPR does see that. They do see significant density variation, but they're always looking ahead of the spacecraft, yeah. Right? And so it gets really hard to calculate what you're magnetically connected to at a given moment compared to what you saw before you got there. Is it a temporal evolution? Is it a spatial evolution? That's hard with one spacecraft. But yes, there are studies moving in that direction.
Hello.
Hi.
Fantastic talk. I was wondering about the same basic thing or similar question. So with these with Apache solar wind corresponding to supergranular scales, does that imply that patchiness is directly tied to convection? Since with the solar convective conundrum, people have found that through helioseismology, that supergranular scale is the dominant length scale of convection at the solar equator. One potential implication of that is that if that solar convective conundrum arises from rotation, then you could potentially see different scales at the poles than you would at the equator.
Right. So with Solar Probe, of course, we're only sampling equatorial, right? Because everything was launched in the ecliptic, because we're launched from Earth, so we can't really change our inclination that well because we're only using Venus. So we can really only measure what's going on near the equator with this. Solar Orbiter, of course, can get out of plane and has the ability to, I think, do some helioseismology work from out of plane. So maybe that's something to compare to. But in terms of the supergranule structures, I mean, basically what was done is what's shown up on here, where they kind of measured the timescales of what they were going through, used a magnetic field model to propagate back, so they had to assume a source surface height, propagated back to that kind of ballistically, and then said, this scale size is kind of like that, to order of magnitude. That's pretty much what has been done so far.
All right, thank you.
The other actual piece to that, if you're related to convection, is the idea that you get these sort of magnetic flux concentrations that kind of funnel outward and then rapidly expand after the corona. And one thought is that you're getting magnetic reconnection to be sort of very efficient at those kind of edges. And that's one thought that's leading to lots of these switchback structures or these sudden reversals in the magnetic field. The thought is that they're patchy because you're looking at a concentration of magnetic flux, which may be related to the convective process you're talking about.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the interesting talk. I have a question about actually on this figure.
Sure.
And what's the cause of the density variation? There is a big density variation in early burst of this, in the left side of this figure, but in a later phase, there are a lot of magnetic field changes, but no density is very flat. What's the cause?
Yeah, so you're looking at the inbound versus outbound, right? So,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
perihelion is somewhere in the middle here. So on the inbound, the density is much higher. On the outbound, the density is much lower. That's not a persistent feature. It shows up on this orbit, but if you go to any other orbit, it's wildly variable.
So the profiles are very different in each orbit. Right?
Yeah, so whether it has anything to do with the patchiness, that's observed, because you're right, it's observed sort of after this density kind of settles out, I'm not sure. There have been a couple of follow-up studies where people have tried to look for that patchiness on other encounters and have found that it manifests quite differently on other encounters. So you'll still see it, but the scale sizes will vary. And I haven't noticed how that's correlated with density, but now that you point that out, we should go look.
Okay.
Thank you.
Interesting.
I'm not a student. My question is, you introduced the concept of ambipolar diffusion. The electrons are moving faster, so they will escape. It's sort of like a gene's escape mechanism. But my question is, if the sun is losing electrons faster than protons, the sun will become positively charged, and that will increase with time. There has to be some physics left out. Any comments, please?
Well, increase with time. So let's see. So you're saying because there's sort of a finite number of particles in the sun, for example, that you're always constantly losing particles. When that charge gets too much, basically what happens is it's pulling in, this is like a current balance kind of process, and you'll just pull in electrons from somewhere else in the solar system. So it's not exactly like the sun is sort of a sealed system and can either enter or lose, right? You can pull current from other places.
Worked out or thought through?
Yeah, to a large
Has this
extent.
been worked out or thought through or published?
Yeah, so some of the publications that I'll point you to are here, these citations here, where they actually work out sort of these exospheric models for the solar wind acceleration. That's where I think is a good place to start, and the references contained therein. But I didn't actually do that work, so I don't have an amazing explanation for you at the moment. All I can say is it's not a closed system, and it will balance itself against electrons it can pull in from the rest of the solar system. So for example, the proportion of electrons that are ballistically either returning to the sun or escaping can change over time.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, in your dust results for this external object orbiting the sun, the beautiful NASA animation, besides this anisotropic distribution of particles on the previous plots, do you see any changes, like in the density profiles or anything when you pass through this area?
Density of the plasma?
Right, yeah. Like, are there any other indications that it might be some external object that's causing this enhancement of dust particles? Just curious.
So far, the biggest clue has been that it happens at a time when you sort of expect solar probe to cross the sort of beta spray that would come from Phaeton. And then the orbital debris path of Phaeton, of course, is not uniform. There's chunks of stuff all along that orbit. And what we have been able to observe is that several orbits later, solar probe went through the same region at the time, like I think it was 1.8 years later or something, the orbital period of Phaeton, when that same chunk would have come back through. And we saw the structure again. So that later evidence gave us a pretty good idea that we are looking at a chunk. of the debris along that orbit. But it's not the asteroid itself, because the asteroid itself is out of phase with what we're seeing. So it's got to be some other piece of it or debris cloud or something.
One more question.
Referring to the dust again, you said that it's almost like a controlled experiment. So just wondering what else you can change. Can you change the potential, the bulk potential in the spacecraft? Can you do some of that stuff to make different observations?
Actually, we can, and we did. So there was a really interesting study that hasn't been published or anything. We just kind of did it to see if we could do it. But you can change the bias potential, so you can, or current. You can drive a bias current on these antennas and therefore change its potential with respect to the ambient environment. And so one of the things we did as an experiment was to take these antennas and drive them into saturation. Basically, we put so much current on them that the potential runs away. It runs away to about 100 volts or something relative to the ambient plasma. So effectively, we charged one of these antennas up to 100 volts. A dust impact came along, hit the spacecraft, created this debris, and then in the WSPR image, what we saw was one corner of the WSPR image, the one toward the antenna that we charged, filled with dust. So the dust, the debris off the spacecraft, the MLI, the paint chips, the whatever, were orbiting the antenna. And then as part of the experiment, we then switched the bias to the other antenna down here, which WSPR can see down in this corner, or down in this corner, and the debris moved and started orbiting the other antenna. So at this point, we're pretty darn sure this is debris coming off the spacecraft that then gets charged by the wind, by interaction with the plasma.
Cool.
Let's thank our speaker again.